Recovered visual records do not begin with banners, speeches, or triumphal declarations. They begin with damage patterns. Survey pick feeds taken from ruined temple courts on Colchis show repeated layers of chiseled iconography, first cut away, then restored, then cut away again. Beneath later ornamentation, investigators identified older devotional markings arranged in concentric script rings, each ring facing inward toward pedestals that no longer held statues. In several excavated vaults, soot residue suggested ritual burnings carried out over many years rather than in a single purge. Bone fragments found beneath collapsed stone stairs were arranged with deliberate symmetry. Oral fragments gathered from descendants of displaced populations describe processions, recitations, and a child of impossible origin who was said to speak with unnatural certainty about a coming power that would descend from the heavens. Cross-comparison between surviving civic tablets, fractured pilgrimage ledgers, and long-degraded battlefield observations suggests that these records all orbit the same historical center. They describe the rise of a world reshaped by revelation, conquest, doctrine, and obedience. They describe the origin environment from which one of the most consequential legions of the Great Crusade would emerge. By the end of that chain of evidence, the subject is unmistakable. The scattered testimony, the sacred architecture, the reorganized military record, and the later imperial devastation all converge upon the same name, the Word-Bearers. Before they carried that name, the Legion existed in a more austere and less culturally distinct form. In the earliest phase of the Great Crusade, the 17th Legion was known as the Imperial Heralds. Some records also preserve the title iconoclasts in connection with their early reputation. Even before the rediscovery of their Primarch, the Legion had already developed an operational identity shaped by proclamation, conversion, and ceremonial compliance. Where some legions were measured primarily by attrition rates, tonnage of orbital bombardment, or the speed of campaign closure, the 17th appears to have been valued for a different kind of utility. They carried the message of Imperial Truth into regions where conquest alone could not stabilize occupation. Their function was not limited to killing resistance. They erased old loyalties, destroyed temples, recast civic myths, and installed a new ideological order. That task demanded soldiers who could serve not only as warriors, but also as visible agents of doctrinal replacement. This early role matters because the later history of the Legion did not emerge from nowhere. Even before Lorgar, the Legion had been operating near the boundary between force and belief. The difference was that, in those early years, the object of loyalty was still the Imperium in its rational and expansionist form. They were employed to break idols, burn creeds, and dismantle pre-imperial cults. They were suited for worlds where symbols mattered as much as fortresses. It is one of the central ironies of their development that a legion once associated with suppressing religion would become the single greatest missionary force for a new and far more destructive form of worship. The transformation began with the rediscovery of the Primarcha Lorgar on Colchis. Colchis was not an industrialized world in the pattern of Mars-aligned forge systems, nor a hyper-rational civil state like Ultramar. It was a deeply religious planet structured around ritual hierarchy, scriptural authority, and competing systems of sacred legitimacy. Power on Colchis was expressed through priesthood, revelation, and control of doctrine as much as through armies. Before Lorgar unified the world, the dominant order was the Covenant, a religious power centered in monumental temples and governed by figures whose authority was reinforced by ceremony, inherited standing, and sacrificial tradition. The society into which Lorgar fell was therefore one already conditioned to seek cosmic meaning in governance, war, and law. Lorgar's early life on Colchis shaped the entire future of the Legion more than any later battlefield victory. Accounts of his youth consistently present him as intellectually precocious, physically superhuman by the standards of the local population, and marked by a certainty that separated him from ordinary rulers. He was raised under the influence of Kor Phaeron, the priest who became both foster father and spiritual tutor. That relationship cannot be reduced to a simple parental bond. Kor Phaeron taught Lorgar within a structure already infused with esoteric belief and institutional manipulation. On Colchis, knowledge of the divine was inseparable from authority over the masses. A child being trained within that system would not merely learn theology, he would learn how faith organises cities, armies, economies, and memory. As Lorgar matured, he did not become a secluded mystic. He became a conqueror whose wars were justified through revelation. He rose against the old structures of Colchis and brought much of the world under his authority through a blend of military success, prophetic legitimacy, and personal charisma. The unification of Colchis was not simply a regional war. It was a civilizational restructuring. Sacred and political authority were collapsed into one body under a leader believed to have foreseen a greater truth. Even before the Emperor arrived, Lorgar had already demonstrated the pattern that would later define the word-bearers. War conducted not only to defeat an enemy, but to reorder meaning itself. One of the most important features of Lorgar's early formation was his expectation of a godlike arrival. He is repeatedly associated with visions of a golden figure descending from the stars, and when the Emperor finally reached Colchis, Lorgar's response was immediate and absolute. Where other Primarchs greeted the Emperor as father, sovereign, or military superior, Lorgar recognized him as an object of worship. This distinction is foundational. It established the emotional and philosophical axis around which the word-bearers would turn for decades. Lorgar did not merely submit, he adored. He did not perceive the Great Crusade as only a political project or species-wide reconquest. He perceived it as the spread of a sacred truth, and he reorganized the 17th Legion accordingly. When Lorgar took command of his legion, the existing Imperial Heralds were transformed at every level. Their military discipline remained, but it was now absorbed into a spiritual program. Ritual, scripture, sermon, and devotion entered the legion's self-conception. The change was not cosmetic. It affected the pace of campaigns, the methods of compliance, and the emotional expectations placed upon the conquered. Worlds brought to heel by the word-bearers were not merely occupied and taxed. They were remade through monumental construction, public recitation, ceremonial submission, and the embedding of imperial worship into urban life. Compliance under the word-bearers often took longer than under more aggressively efficient legions, because they were not satisfied with surrender alone. They sought conviction, or at least the visible architecture of conviction. This was the period in which the Legion took the name by which history remembers them, the Word-Bearers. The title was not an empty flourish. It described function, aspiration, and identity all at once. They were bearers of doctrine, of sacred language, of the Emperor's supposed divinity, and of a mission that blended conquest with catechism. Their war gear, iconography, and battlefield presentation increasingly reflected that change. Although the full elaboration of their symbols and officer cults belongs more properly to later sections, the developmental point begins here. Under Lorgar, the Legion ceased to be only a force of imperial proclamation. It became a priestly military institution. Two figures were central in helping shape this emerging order: Kor Phaeron and Erebus. Kor Phaeron followed Lorgar from Colchis into the Legion's command structure, despite not being a space marine in the full original sense. Enhanced beyond ordinary human limits, he retained enormous influence because his authority came from spiritual intimacy and ideological formation, not from gene-forged equality with the legionaries. Erebus, meanwhile, rose as one of the most dangerous internal architects of the Legion's future. Like Kor Phaeron, he had roots in the religious matrix of Colchis. Unlike many line officers whose identity depended on conventional command excellence, Erebus operated through doctrine, manipulation, and secret knowledge. Together, these two men formed the inner pressure system around Lorgar, reinforcing the centrality of faith, while also preserving older and darker strands of Colchisian belief beneath the surface of imperial piety. This layered religious culture explains why the word-bearers became so structurally different from their brother legions. Other legions had warrior traditions, favoured tactical philosophies, regional habits, or distinct aesthetic codes. The word-bearers developed something closer to a theology of war. Compliance actions became liturgical in tone. Destruction of enemy symbols was paired with the installation of new shrines. Victory was interpreted as confirmation of spiritual truth. Defeat or delay was treated as evidence of insufficient devotion, flawed interpretation, or hidden corruption. Such habits did not make the Legion weak. On the contrary, they made it unusually cohesive for a time, because battle, obedience, and meaning were fused into one framework. Yet that same framework created a fatal incompatibility with the Emperor's actual program. The Emperor did not want worship. He wanted unity under secular imperial rule, with religion suppressed as a destabilizing force. The Great Crusade was meant to extinguish superstition, not elevate the Emperor into a god. The word-bearers misunderstood this at the highest level because Lorgar's entire worldview had been trained to interpret greatness through reverence. The more the Legion loved the Emperor, the further it drifted from his intention. This is the paradox that defines their early history. Their fall began inside their devotion. The most visible expression of this misunderstanding was the city of Monarchia on Kor. Built as a model of perfect compliance, Monarchia represented everything the word-bearers thought the Imperium should become under a sanctified emperor. It was organized, monumental, and explicitly devotional. Its urban form was not only functional but didactic. Every avenue, tower, and congregation space served as evidence that conquest could culminate in sacred civilization. To Lorgar and his sons, this was success in its highest form. To the Emperor, it was a dangerous betrayal of the entire ideological foundation of the Crusade. The destruction of Monarchia was therefore more than a punishment. It was a trauma event that shattered the spiritual architecture of the Legion. Ordered by the Emperor and carried out under the eye of Robert Guilliman and the Ultramarines, the razing of the perfect city was intended as a lesson. Lorgar and the word-bearers were forced to witness the annihilation of their proudest creation, and the Primarch was publicly humiliated for religious excess and for slowing the pace of conquest. The message was clear in administrative terms: conquest must be fast, practical, and secular. But psychologically, the event had far greater consequences. A legion that had built its identity around sacred purpose was told that its purpose was false. This moment cannot be overstated in importance. Monarchia did not instantly convert the word-bearers into servants of chaos, but it destroyed the last stable bridge between Lorgar's nature and the Emperor's design. Humiliation created a vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped the old teachings of Colchis, the buried residues of pre-imperial faith, and the council of men who had never fully abandoned older devotions. When Lorgar withdrew after Monarchia, speaking chiefly with Kor Phaeron and Erebus, the ideological reorientation of the Legion entered its decisive stage. The search that followed was not initially presented within the Legion as simple rebellion. It was framed as inquiry. If the Emperor was not a god, then what was worthy of worship? If the visible universe contained powers beyond human scale, what was their nature? If divinity had been denied in one form, could it exist in another? These questions, once pursued by a legion already predisposed toward faith and already staffed by hidden custodians of the old Colchisian tradition, led toward a catastrophic conclusion. The word-bearers began seeking what later texts describe as the primordial truth. What they found in that search was not enlightenment, but the gods of the warp. Even in this early phase, the significance of the word-bearers extends beyond their own legion history. Their development marks one of the crucial hinge points of the Horus Heresy. They were not simply another legion that turned traitor under pressure of pride, grievance, or ambition. They were the first major instrument through which chaos gained structured, missionary access to the Primarch project itself. Their corruption did not remain private. It spread through council, ritual, infiltration, and carefully staged revelation. The poisoning of Horus would come later. The wider civil war would erupt later. But in developmental terms, the first durable bridge between the Great Crusade and the ruinous powers was built within the 17th Legion. By the end of this first stage of their history, the essential pattern was already fixed. A legion created to break religions had become a legion unable to live without one. A Primarch shaped by prophecy and reverence had mistaken imperial unity for divine kingship. A world of temple politics and sacred war had supplied the cultural grammar through which an entire legion came to interpret reality. A public humiliation meant to correct excess, instead radicalized wounded devotion. And behind the formal structures of command, men like Kor Phaeron and Erebus preserved doctrines that would mutate from hidden influence into open damnation. The word-bearers did not fall in a single instant. They developed toward ruin through continuity. Their original duties prepared them to shape belief. Colchis prepared them to worship. Lorgar gave them a transcendent object. Monarchia stripped that object away. What remained was a hunger for absolute meaning, backed by the military power of an Astartes legion and guided by figures already willing to seek gods that answered. That is where the origin story of the Word-Bearers properly settles at the close of its first movement. Not yet in full heresy, not yet in the open service of chaos, but already transformed from heralds of empire into seekers of forbidden divinity. Their founding and development were not separate phases but one continuous progression. Every stage prepared the next. Every conviction contained its own fracture line. By the time the 17th Legion turned fully against the Imperium, the groundwork had long been laid in the temples of Colchis, in the sermons of Lorgar, in the pride of Monarchia, and in the silent work of those who understood that wounded faith can be redirected more easily than broken steel. The legion that emerged from the aftermath of Monarchia did not abandon structure or discipline. It refined both through a framework that bound identity, equipment, and battlefield conduct to a single interpretive system. Distinctive traits within the word-bearers were not isolated features. They were expressions of a unified approach in which appearance, armament, and action reinforced a shared doctrinal purpose. Observers across multiple campaigns recorded that the 17th Legion displayed a level of internal consistency that exceeded most contemporaries. This consistency was not limited to uniformity of armor or standardized loadouts. It extended into ritual preparation, spoken cadence during advance, and the deliberate pacing of engagements. The most immediately recognizable characteristic of the Legion was its iconography. Armor surfaces were treated as carriers of meaning rather than purely protective shells. Scriptural inscriptions were etched, painted, or burned into ceramite plating. These markings were not decorative excess. They were considered integral to the legionary's function. Each line of text, each sigil, and each geometric arrangement of symbols served as a visible reinforcement of belief. Variations existed between companies and hosts, but the underlying principle remained consistent. The body of the warrior became a surface upon which doctrine was made permanent. In practical terms, this practice also created a psychological effect on opposing forces. Engagement logs frequently note hesitation, confusion, or intensified hostility when enemy combatants encountered ranks of Astartes whose armor appeared less like military equipment and more like mobile reliquaries. Coloration within the Legion evolved over time but settled into a deep, dark crimson as a dominant visual identity. This shift marked a departure from earlier, more neutral or austere schemes associated with the Imperial Heralds. The red was not chosen arbitrarily. It carried layered associations with sacrifice, covenant, and authority. Trim elements often incorporated metallic tones, with gold and brass appearing in officer ranks or specialized units. Helmets, shoulder plates, and chest sections frequently bore additional inscriptions that identified role, affiliation, or doctrinal emphasis. Unlike legions that used color to denote battlefield function alone, the word-bearers used it to encode both hierarchy and belief. Physically, legionaries of the word-bearers did not diverge significantly from baseline Astartes parameters in terms of height, mass, or augmentation. However, observers consistently noted differences in bearing and comportment. Where some legions projected aggression or cold efficiency, the word-bearers often advanced with a controlled, deliberate pace that conveyed assurance rather than urgency. Their movements were described as measured, almost ceremonial in certain phases of engagement. This did not indicate a lack of combat readiness. Instead, it reflected a doctrinal confidence that reduced reliance on reactive behavior. They did not rush to prove dominance. They enacted it according to a pre-established structure. Within their ranks, certain individuals developed reputations that further defined the Legion's distinctive character. Chaplains in particular held a central role. Although many legions maintained spiritual officers or morale leaders, the word-bearers elevated this function into a core command component. Chaplains were not secondary to line officers. They operated alongside them, often shaping the intent and interpretation of engagements. Their presence ensured that every action could be framed within the Legion's belief system. In practice, this meant that orders were not only issued, they were contextualized. Compliance was not merely achieved, it was explained and reinforced through spoken doctrine delivered in real time. This integration of belief into command structure influenced the selection and use of weapons and gear. Standard Astartes armaments such as bolters, chainswords, and power weapons remained prevalent. The Legion did not abandon effective tools. Instead, it adapted them to fit its identity. Bolters, for example, were often modified with engraved casings, extended magazine housings designed for sustained fire during protracted engagements, and sighting systems calibrated for mid-range dominance. Ammunition was not fundamentally altered in early stages, but later developments introduced rounds that were ritually prepared or symbolically marked, reinforcing the idea that each discharge carried not only kinetic force, but also doctrinal significance. Melee weapons held particular importance. Chainswords and power blades were frequently customized with extended grips, reinforced teeth assemblies, or inscriptions along the blade edge. These modifications were not purely aesthetic. Reinforcement allowed for prolonged close combat without degradation, while grip adjustments enabled more controlled, repeatable strike patterns. Reports indicate that word-bearer units often favored sustained melee pressure once engagement lines closed, maintaining formation cohesion while applying continuous force. This contrasted with more aggressive shock assaults used by legions that prioritized rapid breakthrough. The word-bearers preferred to dominate space incrementally, ensuring that each advance could be stabilized before proceeding further. Armor configurations followed a similar pattern of adaptation. Power armor was maintained to standard Astartes specifications in terms of protection and life support, but additional components were integrated to support extended operations. Reinforced joint seals, redundant communication arrays, and expanded data storage units allowed legionaries to operate in environments where immediate resupply or command oversight was limited. This was particularly important during compliance actions that involved prolonged occupation or restructuring of local populations. The Legion needed to remain present not only as a military force but as a governing influence. Their equipment reflected that requirement. Vehicles and heavy support assets were employed with a focus on reliability and sustained presence. Rhino transports, land raiders, and other standard platforms were used extensively, often configured for durability rather than speed. Armor plating was reinforced where possible, and maintenance protocols were observed with unusual strictness. Machine spirits were treated with a level of reverence that, while not unique among the legions, was integrated more deeply into the word-bearer's operational mindset. Crews were trained to interpret mechanical performance not only through technical diagnostics, but through a framework that acknowledged the spirit of the machine as an active participant in the campaign. Artillery and heavy weapon teams operated with a similar emphasis on controlled application of force. Instead of overwhelming bombardment designed to obliterate entire regions in a single phase, the word-bearers often employed staggered fire patterns. These patterns allowed for progressive destruction, shaping the battlefield in stages. Defensive positions were weakened, communication lines disrupted, and population centers isolated before final assaults were initiated. This approach aligned with their broader objective of restructuring rather than annihilating. Complete destruction was reserved for cases where resistance was deemed irredeemable or strategically intolerable. Tactical doctrine within the Legion can be understood as a synthesis of patience, cohesion, and interpretive control. Engagements were rarely initiated without preparatory phases that included reconnaissance, psychological conditioning of the target environment, and the establishment of symbolic dominance. Vox transmissions intercepted during early campaigns indicate that the word-bearers frequently broadcast messages ahead of direct assault. These transmissions combined demands for compliance with statements that framed the Legion's arrival as inevitable and justified. The intent was to weaken resistance before physical engagement began. Once combat commenced, the Legion favoured layered advances. Initial contact units established pressure on enemy lines, drawing attention and resources. Secondary elements manoeuvred to exploit structural weaknesses, often targeting command nodes, communication hubs, and logistical support points. Rather than collapsing the entire enemy formation at once, the word-bearers dismantled it in segments. Each segment, once isolated, was subjected to concentrated force until it could no longer function as part of a coherent defense. This method reduced the likelihood of unpredictable counterattacks and allowed the Legion to maintain control over the pace of battle. Coordination between units was maintained through disciplined communication protocols. Orders were transmitted clearly and repeated as necessary to ensure uniform understanding. Deviation from assigned roles was discouraged unless explicitly authorized. This emphasis on adherence did not eliminate flexibility, but it ensured that any adaptation occurred within a controlled framework. The result was a force that could adjust to changing conditions without fragmenting into disorganized elements. Psychological pressure was a deliberate component of their doctrine. The visual impact of their armor, the cadence of their advance, and the content of their transmissions were all designed to influence enemy perception. Reports from conquered worlds describe defenders experiencing a gradual erosion of confidence as engagements progressed. The word-bearers did not rely solely on sudden shock. They imposed a continuous presence that made resistance appear increasingly futile. By the time final assaults were launched, opposing forces were often already destabilized. In extended campaigns, the Legion demonstrated a capacity for integration with auxiliary forces and local collaborators. Once a region was brought under control, selected elements of the population were incorporated into support roles. These roles range from logistical assistance to participation in security operations. The process was overseen by Legion officers and chaplains, ensuring that integration aligned with the broader doctrinal framework. While this practice increased operational efficiency, it also served to embed the Legion's influence more deeply within the conquered territory. The combination of these traits, equipment adaptations and tactical methods, produced a force that operated with a distinctive rhythm. They did not seek the fastest victory, nor the most dramatic display of power. They sought a controlled outcome in which resistance was eliminated, structures were redefined, and the Legion's presence was established as both dominant and enduring. This approach required time, discipline, and a willingness to engage beyond the immediate demands of battle. It is important to recognize that these characteristics were fully developed before the Legion's open alignment with the forces of the Warp. Their identity as the word-bearers was already complete in functional terms. The integration of belief into warfare, the use of symbolism as a practical tool, and the preference for structured, progressive conquest were all established during this phase. Later transformations would intensify these traits and introduce new elements, but the foundation was already in place. By the conclusion of this stage, the Legion stood as a force defined not only by its capacity for combat, but by its ability to shape environments, populations, and perceptions. Its warriors carried more than weapons. They carried a system of interpretation that governed how those weapons were used. Its commanders issued more than orders. They provided context that aligned action with belief. Its campaigns achieved more than territorial gain. They reconfigured the meaning of victory itself. This integration of distinctive traits, specialized gear, and disciplined doctrine explains why the word-bearers became such a pivotal force in later events. When their ideological direction shifted, the mechanisms required to spread that shift were already embedded within their structure. The same systems that had once enforced Imperial Truth would be repurposed to propagate a different form of allegiance. The tools were the same, the interpretation changed, and with that change, the impact of the Legion extended far beyond any single battlefield. The internal character of the Legion cannot be reduced to discipline alone. Beneath the visible cohesion, existed a shared personality profile shaped by belief, hierarchy, and the experience of collective correction. Word-bearers legionaries were conditioned to interpret their existence through purpose rather than individual distinction. Personal identity did not disappear, but it was consistently subordinated to a broader narrative in which each warrior served as a component of a larger unfolding design. This orientation produced a temperament that combined patience with certainty. They did not seek constant validation through rapid victory or personal acclaim. They sought alignment with what they understood to be a higher order of meaning. This personality structure was reinforced during training and indoctrination. New legionaries were not only instructed in combat and tactical reasoning, they were immersed in a system of interpretation that framed every action as part of a wider continuum. Success was not merely measured in objectives completed. It was evaluated in terms of correctness of intent and adherence to doctrine. Failure, when it occurred, was analysed not only as a tactical miscalculation, but as a deviation from proper understanding. This approach created individuals who were highly resilient to uncertainty. When confronted with unexpected developments, they did not default to hesitation. They reinterpreted the situation within their existing framework and continued to act with confidence. The presence of spiritual authority within the Legion's structure amplified this effect. Chaplains and senior doctrinal figures did not operate as distant advisors. They were embedded within operational units, maintaining continuous influence over interpretation and morale. Their role extended beyond maintaining cohesion. They ensured that each legionary's internal narrative remained consistent with the Legion's overarching direction. In practical terms, this reduced the likelihood of fragmentation under pressure. Even in prolonged engagements, where other forces might experience breakdowns in coordination or morale, the word-bearers maintained a stable internal alignment. At the level of senior leadership, this alignment took on a more complex form. Lorgar himself functioned as both Primarch and central ideological reference point. His authority was not limited to command decisions. It extended into the definition of truth for the Legion. This created a structure in which loyalty to Lorgar was inseparable from loyalty to the Legion's identity. When Lorgar's interpretation shifted, the entire Legion was capable of shifting with him. This capacity for collective reorientation would later prove decisive, but even in this earlier phase, it defined how the Legion understood change. Change was not resisted if it originated from the correct source. It was adopted as a necessary evolution. Beneath Lorgar, the influence of figures such as Kor Phaeron and Erebus introduced additional layers to the Legion's personality. These individuals did not always operate through direct command authority. They shaped perception, guided interpretation, and introduced concepts that were not immediately visible within official doctrine. Their presence ensured that the Legion's internal culture remained dynamic rather than static. While the outward structure appeared stable, internal currents of thought continued to develop. This duality allowed the Legion to maintain outward cohesion, while gradually preparing for more significant transformation. Interpersonal relationships within the Legion reflected this structure. Bonds between legionaries were strong, but they were mediated through shared belief rather than personal familiarity alone. Trust was derived from demonstrated adherence to doctrine and reliability in action. A legionary who consistently aligned with the Legion's principles was regarded as dependable, regardless of personal background or prior association. This created a network of relationships that was both resilient and adaptable. Units could be reorganized without significant loss of cohesion, because the basis of trust was not tied to fixed groupings. The Legion's approach to external populations also reveals important aspects of its personality. Unlike forces that relied primarily on intimidation or immediate suppression, the word-bearers engaged with conquered societies through a process that combined authority with instruction. They did not assume that compliance alone was sufficient. They sought to establish a framework in which the population could understand and accept its new position. This approach required patience and a willingness to invest time in restructuring local systems. It also reflected a belief that stable control depended on internal acceptance rather than continuous external enforcement. Organisationally, the word-bearers maintained a structure that balanced formal hierarchy with distributed doctrinal authority. Standard Astartes command tiers remained in place, ensuring clarity in operational decisions. However, the integration of chaplains and other doctrinal figures created a parallel channel of influence that operated alongside traditional command. This did not produce conflict within the Legion during this phase because both channels were aligned under Lorgar's direction. Instead, it enhanced the Legion's ability to maintain consistency across diverse operational contexts. The Legion was divided into hosts and companies that could operate independently while remaining connected to the central framework. Each host possessed the capability to conduct extended campaigns without immediate reinforcement, supported by integrated logistical elements and communication systems. This decentralization allowed the word-bearers to project influence across wide regions without losing coherence. Even when separated by significant distances, individual formations maintained alignment through shared doctrine and consistent communication protocols. Administrative functions within the Legion were handled with a level of detail that reflected their broader approach to control. Records were maintained not only for logistical purposes, but also for doctrinal tracking. Campaign outcomes, population responses, and structural changes within conquered regions were documented and analysed. This information was used to refine future operations, creating a feedback loop that improved efficiency over time. The Legion did not rely solely on traditional precedent. It incorporated observed results into its evolving methodology. The relationship between the word-bearers and the wider Imperium during this period was outwardly cooperative but internally divergent. On the surface, the Legion continued to fulfill its assigned role within the Great Crusade. It brought worlds into compliance, supported Imperial expansion, and maintained operational readiness. However, the interpretation of these actions differed from the Emperor's intent. Where the Imperium sought secular unity, the word-bearers increasingly framed their efforts in terms of spiritual fulfillment. This divergence was not immediately visible in administrator reports or battlefield outcomes. It existed within the Legion's internal narrative, shaping decisions in subtle but significant ways. This divergence influenced how the Legion evaluated success. A campaign that achieved rapid compliance but failed to establish lasting ideological alignment was considered incomplete. Conversely, a campaign that required extended effort but resulted in deep structural integration was viewed as successful. This recalibration of priorities affected resource allocation, deployment schedules, and long-term planning. The Legion was willing to invest additional time and effort if it believed the outcome would be more stable and meaningful. The cumulative effect of these traits was the creation of an organization that operated with a high degree of internal coherence and a clear sense of purpose. Its members understood not only what they were doing, but why they were doing it. This clarity reduced internal friction and allowed the Legion to function efficiently across a range of conditions. It also made the Legion highly receptive to shifts in its guiding principles. When the underlying interpretation changed, the entire structure could adapt without requiring fundamental reorganization. By the conclusion of this stage in their history, the word-bearers had fully transitioned from their origins as the Imperial Heralds into a legion defined by integrated belief and action. Their personality was characterized by patience, certainty, and a willingness to subordinate individual perspective to collective purpose. Their organizational alignment combined formal hierarchy with embedded doctrinal authority, creating a system capable of maintaining coherence across extended operations. Their methods of engagement extended beyond combat into the restructuring of societies, reflecting a broader understanding of control. This configuration explains the scale of their later impact. The Legion did not need to be rebuilt in order to adopt a new direction. It needed only to reinterpret its existing framework. The same structures that supported Imperial expansion could be redirected toward a different objective. The same traits that ensured cohesion could facilitate rapid ideological transformation. The same emphasis on meaning could be applied to a new source of authority. The conclusion of this chapter therefore rests not on a single event but on a completed transformation. The Word-Bearers entered the later stages of the Great Crusade as a legion already distinct from its counterparts in both mindset and structure. Its identity was stable, its methods refined, and its internal alignment secure. What remained unresolved was the question of ultimate allegiance. That question, once answered, would determine not only the fate of the legion, but the trajectory of the wider conflict that followed. In this sense, the Word-Bearers stand as a case study in how purpose can shape organization, and how organization can amplify the consequences of belief. Their origins, development, and internal alignment created a system that was both highly effective and inherently vulnerable to reinterpretation. When that reinterpretation occurred, the results extended far beyond the boundaries of a single legion, influencing events on a scale that would redefine the Imperium itself. Administrative records compiled during the later phases of the Great Crusade present a layered assessment of the 17th Legion that differs in tone from earlier compliance reports. While official summaries continued to classify the Word-Bearers as effective agents of expansion, appended observations from both the Adeptus Administratum and the Mechanicum reveal a pattern of operational irregularities that were not immediately categorized as failures, but were consistently flagged for review. These irregularities did not manifest as battlefield incompetence. On the contrary, the Legion maintained a high rate of eventual compliance across assigned theatres. The concern instead centred on the manner in which those outcomes were achieved. Administratum analysts responsible for tracking campaign efficiency noted that Word-Bearer operations exhibited extended timelines when compared to other legions operating under similar conditions. Where rapid compliance could be achieved through concentrated force and targeted decapitation strikes, the 17th frequently elected to prolong engagement phases. Initial reports interpreted this as caution or thoroughness. However, repeated patterns indicated that the extended timelines were not incidental. They were a consistent feature of the Legion's approach. Worlds brought into compliance under their authority often underwent significant structural and cultural modification prior to final integration into Imperial governance. These modifications included the construction of large-scale architectural projects, the reorganization of local administrative hierarchies, and the implementation of new systems of public assembly. From a purely logistical perspective, these activities required substantial allocation of resources and personnel. Supply chains were extended, construction materials diverted, and labour forces redirected from standard production roles. While these efforts did not prevent eventual compliance, they introduced inefficiencies that were difficult to reconcile with the broader objectives of the Crusade. Administratum projections indicated that, if applied universally, such methods would significantly slow the rate of Imperial expansion. Mechanicum observers assigned to support Word-Bearer campaigns provided additional context through technical and behavioural analysis. Their reports focused on patterns of equipment use, maintenance protocols, and interaction with machine systems. One of the most frequently noted characteristics was the Legion's approach to maintenance. Word-Bearer units demonstrated a high degree of care in preserving the operational integrity of their war gear. This was not unusual in isolation. However, the manner in which maintenance was conducted differed from standard procedure. Ritualized sequences were observed in preparation, execution, and completion of repair cycles. These sequences included spoken components and symbolic gestures that had no measurable impact on mechanical function. From a Mechanicum perspective, such practices were categorized as non-essential, yet they were not dismissed outright, as they did not degrade performance and were consistently associated with high levels of equipment reliability. In some cases, Word-Bearer assets exhibited lower rates of mechanical failure than comparable units operating under more conventional protocols. This created a point of analytical tension. Practices that were technically unnecessary appeared to contribute to overall system stability, at least indirectly. Mechanicum logs therefore recorded these observations without formal endorsement, noting that further study would be required to determine whether the correlation was coincidental or causative. Strategic assessments also highlighted the Legion's communication patterns. Vox traffic captured during joint operations revealed a distinct difference in transmission content and cadence. Wordbearer communications often included extended statements preceding or following operational directives. These statements provided contextual framing for the actions being undertaken. While they did not interfere with the clarity of orders, they increased transmission length and in certain cases introduced delays in rapid response scenarios. Administratum reviewers initially categorized this as inefficiency. However, cross-analysis with battlefield outcomes suggested that these communications contributed to a higher degree of unit cohesion during extended engagements. Another area of interest was the Legion's interaction with local populations during and after compliance. Standard Imperial procedure prioritized the establishment of governance structures, resource extraction systems, and defensive installations. The word-bearers fulfilled these requirements, but supplemented them with additional measures aimed at influencing local belief systems. Administratum records describe the organization of public gatherings, the dissemination of standardized texts, and the integration of symbolic elements into civic architecture. These activities were not explicitly mandated by central command directives. Their consistent presence across multiple campaigns indicated that they were internally generated rather than externally imposed. The long-term effects of these measures were difficult to quantify within the reporting periods typically used by the administratum. Short-term stability metrics often showed improvement in regions where the word-bearers had conducted extended integration efforts. Rates of rebellion and civil unrest were lower than average in the immediate aftermath of compliance. However, the resource expenditure required to achieve these outcomes remained a point of concern. Strategic planners questioned whether the benefits justified the cost, particularly in sectors where rapid expansion was prioritized over deep consolidation. Mechanicum personnel also documented the Legion's treatment of recovered or repurposed technology. In contrast to legions that focused on immediate integration of captured assets into operational use, the word-bearers exhibited a more deliberate approach. Devices and systems were catalogued, examined, and in some cases subjected to processes that combined technical analysis with symbolic interpretation. These processes did not align with standard Mechanicum protocols, which emphasized empirical evaluation and functional integration. While the Legion did not interfere with Mechanicum authority over technology, its parallel practices introduced additional variables into the handling of recovered assets. Joint operations between the word-bearers and other legions provided further data points for analysis. Reports from these engagements often noted differences in operational tempo and priority alignment. In scenarios where multiple legions were assigned to a single objective, coordination challenges occasionally arose due to differing approaches to engagement. The word-bearers' emphasis on controlled progression and environmental restructuring contrasted with the more direct methods employed by legions focused on rapid neutralization of opposition. While these differences did not result in mission failure, they required adjustments in planning and execution to maintain overall coherence. Strategic findings derived from these observations led to a set of provisional conclusions within Administratum and Mechanicum circles. The word-bearers were assessed as a highly reliable force in terms of eventual outcome. Their campaigns consistently achieved compliance and demonstrated a capacity for long-term stabilization. However, this reliability was accompanied by a tendency toward extended operational timelines and increased resource consumption. Their methods produced depth of control at the expense of speed. From a purely expansionist perspective, this trade-off was problematic. The Great Crusade operated under the assumption that rapid acquisition of territory and resources was essential to securing the Imperium's long-term position. Any factor that reduced the rate of expansion was subject to scrutiny. At the same time, the benefits of stable integration could not be ignored. Regions secured by the word-bearers required fewer subsequent interventions, reducing the need for repeated deployments. Mechanicum evaluations added a further dimension to this analysis by considering the Legion's interaction with systems and infrastructure. The high reliability of their equipment, combined with their structured maintenance practices, suggested a level of operational sustainability that exceeded baseline expectations. This sustainability was particularly valuable in extended campaigns where resupply lines were stretched. However, the non-standard elements of their maintenance routines remained a point of uncertainty, as they could not be easily replicated or standardized across other forces. Underlying these practical observations was a more subtle but persistent theme. Both Administratum and Mechanicum reports occasionally referenced an intangible quality in the Legion's operations. This quality was described in terms such as cohesion, conviction, or interpretive consistency. While difficult to quantify, it was consistently associated with the Legion's ability to maintain performance under conditions that might degrade the effectiveness of other forces. Analysts noted that word-bearer units showed a lower incidence of breakdown and coordination, even during prolonged engagements or in environments with limited external support. At the time these reports were compiled, this quality was not identified as a potential risk factor. It was treated as a characteristic that contributed to the Legion's effectiveness. However, in retrospective analysis, it can be understood as a precursor to later developments. A force that operates with such a high degree of internal alignment is capable of executing complex and sustained operations with minimal internal resistance. If the underlying alignment shifts, the same capability can be redirected toward entirely different objectives. By the end of this observation phase, the word-bearers were formally categorized as a specialized force within the broader structure of the Great Crusade. They were not reassigned or restricted, but their operational profile was noted as distinct. Strategic planners began to account for their unique characteristics when allocating campaigns, often assigning them to regions where long-term stabilization was considered more critical than immediate expansion. These impressions, observations, and strategic findings did not yet indicate the full extent of the Legion's divergence from Imperial doctrine. They did, however, establish a documented record of difference. The word-bearers were effective, but not in the same way as their counterparts. Their methods produced results that were both beneficial and problematic, depending on the metrics applied. Their internal cohesion was an asset, but also a variable that was not fully understood. In isolation, each of these observations could be interpreted as a minor deviation or a unique operational preference. Taken together, they form a pattern that distinguishes the Legion at a structural level. This pattern would later provide the foundation for developments that extended beyond the scope of standard administrative or technical analysis. At this stage, however, it remained within the realm of observation, recorded, archived, and noted for future reference without immediate corrective action. Resource allocation records associated with the 17th Legion present a distribution pattern that differs in both scale and application from comparable forces. While baseline provisioning remained consistent with standard Astartes requirements, supplemental allocations reveal an emphasis on sustainability over rapid expenditure. Supply manifests indicate increased reserves of construction materials, communication infrastructure components, and portable fabrication units. These resources were not incidental additions. They were consistently requested and deployed across multiple campaigns, suggesting that the Legion anticipated extended operational durations as a default condition rather than an exception. Administrium analysts noted that these additional resources enabled the word-bearers to establish semi-permanent operational zones within conquered regions. Instead of relying solely on temporary encampments or orbital support, the Legion frequently constructed ground-based facilities that served as logistical hubs, command centers, and points of influence over local populations. These installations were often integrated into existing urban environments, or constructed as new focal points within restructured settlements. From a resource perspective, this approach required a higher initial investment, but reduced long-term dependency on external supply lines. Mechanicum assessments of these facilities highlighted their durability and adaptability. Structural designs incorporated redundant systems and modular components, allowing for rapid reconfiguration in response to changing conditions. Power generation units were calibrated for efficiency and longevity, minimizing the need for frequent maintenance interventions. In several documented cases, installations established by the word-bearers continued to function effectively long after primary Legion forces had redeployed, providing ongoing support to Imperial governance structures. The Legion's internal resource management also demonstrated a high degree of organization. Inventory tracking systems were maintained with precision, ensuring that equipment, ammunition, and support materials were distributed according to operational priorities. This level of control reduced instances of resource depletion during critical phases of engagement. It also allowed the Legion to sustain pressure over extended periods without requiring immediate resupply. Administratum projections indicated that, under similar conditions, other legions would experience logistical strain at a faster rate. In terms of manpower, the Word-Bearers maintained a force composition that balanced line infantry, specialist units, and support elements. While the exact number of legionaries fluctuated due to ongoing recruitment and attrition, available records suggest that the Legion operated at a capacity comparable to its counterparts during the mid-stages of the Great Crusade. However, the distribution of roles within the Legion reflected its unique priorities. A higher proportion of personnel was allocated to functions related to coordination, communication, and doctrinal enforcement. This allocation did not reduce combat effectiveness. Instead, it enhanced the Legion's ability to maintain cohesion across dispersed operations. Strength analysis conducted by the Administratum identified several key advantages. Foremost among these was the Legion's capacity for sustained engagement. The combination of resource reserves, durable infrastructure, and disciplined management allowed the Word-Bearers to operate effectively in environments where other forces might be forced to withdraw or redeploy. This endurance was complemented by their methodical approach to combat, which minimized unnecessary losses and preserved combat strength over time. Another significant strength was their internal cohesion. The integration of belief into operational structure created a level of alignment that reduced the likelihood of internal conflict or breakdown. Units operated with a shared understanding of objectives and methods, allowing for efficient coordination even in complex scenarios. This cohesion extended to interactions with auxiliary forces and local collaborators, enabling the Legion to incorporate external elements into its operations without compromising stability. The Legion also demonstrated a notable capacity for environmental control. Through the combined use of infrastructure development, population management, and psychological influence, the Word-Bearers were able to reshape operational theatres to their advantage. This capability reduced the effectiveness of enemy resistance and created conditions that favoured sustained control. In strategic terms, this translated into a higher probability of long-term stability in regions under their influence. However, these strengths were accompanied by identifiable weaknesses. The most prominent of these was the Legion's extended operational timeline. While their methods produced stable outcomes, they required more time to implement. In sectors where rapid expansion was critical, this approach created delays that could impact broader strategic objectives. Administratum planners noted that reliance on Word-Bearer methods across multiple fronts would significantly reduce the overall pace of the crusade. Resource consumption also presented a challenge. Although the Legion's infrastructure reduced long-term supply demands, the initial investment required to establish these systems was substantial. This created periods of increased logistical strain, particularly in campaigns involving multiple concurrent operations. In comparison to legions that relied on rapid assault and minimal post-conflict development, the Word-Bearers required a more sustained flow of materials and support. Another area of concern was their reliance on internal doctrinal alignment. While this cohesion was a strength under stable conditions, it introduced a potential vulnerability. A force that depends heavily on a unified interpretive framework may experience systemic disruption if that framework is compromised or altered. At the time of analysis, this risk was considered theoretical rather than immediate. However, it was noted as a factor that could influence long-term stability. Mechanicum evaluations identified additional considerations related to the Legion's interaction with technology. While their maintenance practices contributed to high reliability, the incorporation of non-standard procedures introduced variables that could not be easily quantified. These variables did not produce negative outcomes in observed cases, but they complicated efforts to standardize or replicate the Legion's methods across other forces. From a technical perspective, this limited the broader applicability of their approach. Military power assessments placed the word-bearers within the upper tier of Legiones Astartes in terms of overall capability. Their strength did not derive from overwhelming speed or singular tactical innovation. It emerged from the integration of multiple factors, including sustained operational capacity, coordinated unit behavior, and effective resource utilization. In engagements where time and control were critical variables, the Legion demonstrated a clear advantage. Comparative analysis with other legions highlighted these distinctions. Forces that prioritized rapid assault could achieve immediate victories but often required subsequent deployments to maintain control. The word-bearers, by contrast, invested more heavily in initial operations to reduce the need for later intervention. This approach resulted in a different distribution of effort across the campaign lifecycle. Immediate gains were slower, but long-term stability was more consistent. The Legion's ability to project power across multiple theatres simultaneously was supported by its decentralized structure. Independent hosts could operate with minimal direct oversight while maintaining alignment with central objectives. This allowed the word-bearers to extend their influence over wide Kshatrone without significant degradation in performance. Communication systems ensured that information flowed efficiently between units, enabling coordinated action even when formations were geographically dispersed. Psychological factors also contributed to the Legion's military power. The deliberate presentation of their forces, combined with structured communication strategies, influenced enemy perception and behavior. Opposing forces often experienced a gradual decline in morale as engagements progressed, reducing their capacity for organized resistance. This effect complemented the Legion's physical capabilities, enhancing overall effectiveness. In summary, the word-bearers were assessed as a force defined by endurance, cohesion, and structured application of resources. Their strengths lay in their ability to sustain operations, maintain internal alignment, and reshape environments to support long-term control. Their weaknesses were primarily associated with the time and resources required to implement their methods, as well as the potential risks inherent in their reliance on a unified doctrinal framework. From the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum and the Mechanicum, these characteristics positioned the Legion as both a valuable asset and a specialized tool. They were highly effective when assigned to objectives that required depth of control and stability. They were less suited to scenarios demanding rapid, large-scale expansion without extended consolidation phases. These findings reinforced the classification of the word-bearers as a distinct operational entity within the broader structure of the Great Crusade. Their methods could not be easily generalized, nor could they be replaced without altering the nature of the outcomes they produced. As such, strategic planners continued to deploy them in roles that leveraged their strengths while accounting for their limitations, integrating their unique capabilities into the wider Imperial effort without fully resolving the underlying differences in approach. Campaign archives attributed to the 17th Legion present a sequence of engagements that, when analysed collectively, reveal a consistent operational pattern rather than isolated instances of variation. These records, compiled across multiple sectors during the mid to later phases of the Great Crusade, document the Legion's involvement in compliance actions that range from small-scale planetary integrations to multi-system stabilization efforts. While individual engagements varied in scale and opposition, the outcomes demonstrate a recurring structure in both execution and result. One of the most frequently cited operational theatres involves the Kor system, where the construction and subsequent destruction of Monarchia became a defining event not only for the Legion, but for Imperial policy interpretation. Prior to its destruction, Monarchia represented the culmination of the word-bearers' approach to compliance. The city was constructed as a centralized administrative and symbolic hub, integrating governance, infrastructure, and ideological influence into a single coordinated system. Administratum observers initially classified the project as an advanced model for long-term planetary stabilization. Resource input was high, but the resulting structure exhibited exceptional levels of order and compliance among the local population. The destruction of Monarchia carried out under direct imperial order, produced immediate and measurable consequences. From a material standpoint, the loss of infrastructure represented a significant waste of resources and labour. From an operational perspective, the event forced a reassessment of the Legion's methods. Administratum reports following the incident note a shift in deployment patterns, with the word-bearers being assigned to campaigns where extended integration efforts could be justified or contained. Mechanicum records, meanwhile, document the dismantling of complex systems within Monarchia, noting both the efficiency of their construction and the completeness of their removal. Beyond Kor, multiple compliance campaigns provide additional data on the Legion's performance. In several frontier regions characterized by fragmented political structures and decentralized resistance, the word-bearers achieved integration through a phased approach. Initial engagements focused on neutralizing organized military opposition. This was followed by targeted reconstruction of administrative systems and the introduction of new governance frameworks. Administratum summaries indicate that these regions exhibited lower rates of post-compliance unrest compared to sectors integrated through rapid assault methods. However, the time required to achieve these outcomes remained significantly higher. In contrast, engagements against more technologically advanced or heavily fortified opponents required adaptation of the Legion's standard approach. Records from these campaigns show an increased reliance on coordinated assaults supported by heavy weaponry and mechanized units. While the Legion maintained its emphasis on structured progression, the intensity of combat phases was elevated to meet the capabilities of the opposition. Mechanicum logs from these operations highlight the effective use of combined arms tactics, with infantry, armor, and support units operating in synchronized patterns that maximize pressure while minimizing exposure. Joint operations with other legions further illustrate the word-bearer's operational profile. In campaigns where multiple forces were deployed, the 17th Legion often assumed roles that involved consolidation and stabilization following initial breakthroughs achieved by more aggressive units. Administratum coordination records describe instances where rapid assault legions secured key objectives, after which the word-bearers were tasked with restructuring the environment to ensure long-term control. This division of labour allowed for efficient progression of the crusade while accommodating the differing strengths of each force. However, these joint operations also exposed friction points. Differences in operational tempo and priority occasionally resulted in delays or the need for reallocation of resources. Reports note that word-bearer units sometimes extended their presence in regions beyond the timeframe anticipated by overall campaign planners. While this did not compromise mission success, it required adjustments in broader strategic planning to account for the Legion's methods. Mechanicum observations during these campaigns consistently emphasized the reliability of word-bearer equipment and infrastructure. Systems deployed by the Legion maintained functionality under conditions that might degrade less robust configurations. This reliability contributed to the Legion's ability to sustain prolonged operations without significant loss of capability. In several cases, Mechanicum personnel recommended the study of word-bearer maintenance practices to identify elements that could be adapted for wider use, although the non-standard aspects of these practices limited their direct application. Analysis of casualty rates across documented engagements indicates that the word-bearers maintained a balance between offensive effectiveness and force preservation. While not the lowest in terms of losses, their casualty rates were generally consistent with or below averages for operations of similar scale and complexity. This suggests that their methodical approach to combat, combined with their emphasis on cohesion and control, contributed to reduced exposure to unnecessary risk. The cumulative results of these campaigns led to a refined assessment within Administratum and Mechanicum circles. The word-bearers were confirmed as a force capable of achieving not only compliance, but sustained stability in integrated regions. Their methods produced outcomes that aligned with long-term Imperial interests in maintaining control over newly acquired territories. However, the cost in time and resources remained a limiting factor in their broader application. From a strategic perspective, the Legion's effectiveness was context-dependent. In regions where rapid expansion was the primary objective, their approach was less advantageous. In areas requiring deep integration and long-term stability, they provided capabilities that were difficult to replicate. This duality reinforced their classification as a specialized asset within the Imperial war effort. Conclusion records compiled at the end of this analysis phase reflect a balanced evaluation of the Legion's role. The word-bearers were neither categorized as inefficient nor exemplary in a universal sense. Instead, they were recognized as a force whose methods produced distinct outcomes that required careful consideration in strategic planning. Their campaigns demonstrated that stability could be achieved through structured integration, but also highlighted the trade-offs inherent in such an approach. Underlying these conclusions is an acknowledgement of the Legion's unique internal alignment. Their ability to maintain cohesion, manage resources effectively, and execute complex operations over extended periods set them apart from other forces. At the time, this alignment was viewed primarily as a strength. It enabled consistent performance and reduced variability in outcomes. However, it also represented a concentration of influence that was not fully understood. In retrospective analysis, the documented wars and their results provide more than a record of military performance. They reveal a system operating at a high level of efficiency within its chosen parameters, yet diverging from the broader strategic intent of the Imperium. The word-bearers achieved what they set out to do, but what they set out to do was not always aligned with the priorities of Central Command. At this stage, these differences remained within acceptable limits. The Legion continued to serve the Imperium, fulfill its assigned roles, and contribute to the expansion of Imperial territory. The deviations observed in their methods were noted, analysed, and incorporated into planning considerations rather than treated as immediate concerns. The full implications of these patterns would only become apparent later, when the same structures that enabled effective compliance and stability were redirected toward a different objective. For the Administratum and the Mechanicum, the records of this period stand as a comprehensive account of a Legion operating at peak functional capacity, its strengths and limitations clearly defined, its impact measurable, and its future trajectory not yet fully recognized. Inquisitorial records compiled from fragmented archives, intercepted transmissions, and post-campaign audits present a markedly different interpretive tone when assessing the 17th Legion. Where earlier Administratum and Mechanicum reports focused on measurable outcomes and logistical patterns, Inquisition documentation centers on inconsistency, implication, and latent deviation. The Legion is not immediately categorized as compromised during this stage. Instead, it is treated as a subject of increasing scrutiny, with multiple minor anomalies accumulating into a pattern that resists simple classification. Initial impressions recorded by inquisitorial observers often begin with a recurring observation. The word-bearers demonstrate an unusually high degree of internal certainty. This certainty is not expressed through arrogance or overt defiance, but through an absence of doubt in both decision-making and execution. In isolation, such confidence might be interpreted as discipline. However, comparative analysis with other legions indicates that even the most cohesive forces exhibit internal variation in interpretation and response. The word-bearers, by contrast, display a near-uniform alignment in perception. This level of synchronization is identified as atypical and noted for continued observation. Field reports gathered from compliant worlds following word-bearer intervention provide additional points of interest. Civil populations subjected to their methods exhibit rapid stabilization, but also demonstrate behavioral uniformity that exceeds expected parameters. Testimonies collected from local administrators describe a shift not only in governance, but in collective outlook. Resistance movements dissolve with minimal residual activity, and civic structures reorganize with limited friction. While these outcomes align with Imperial objectives, the speed and completeness of the transition raise questions regarding the mechanisms employed. In several cases, inquisitorial agents embedded within newly compliant regions reported the presence of structured gatherings that continued beyond the formal conclusion of military operations. These gatherings were characterized by recitation, repetition of standardized texts, and the reinforcement of a central authority figure. While such activities could be interpreted as extensions of Imperial doctrine, their persistence and organisation suggest a deeper level of influence. Cross-referencing these observations with known Legion practices indicates that they are not isolated incidents, but components of a broader pattern. Observations of Legion behaviour during active campaigns further contribute to this pattern. Inquisitorial operatives assigned to joint operations noted that word-bearer units often maintained internal communication channels that were not fully accessible to Allied forces. These channels were used to transmit information that appeared supplementary rather than essential to immediate tactical execution. The content of these transmissions, when partially intercepted, included references to alignment, purpose, and validation that extended beyond standard operational language. While not explicitly contradictory to Imperial doctrine, the tone and framing diverged from established norms. Conspiracy findings begin to emerge from the intersection of these observations. One recurring theme within inquisitorial records is the possibility that the Legion's methods are guided by a framework not fully disclosed within official command structures. This framework is not identified as heretical in early assessments, but it is considered opaque. The presence of influential figures such as Kor Phaeron and Erebus is frequently noted in this context. Both individuals are associated with the dissemination of ideas and practices that do not originate from standard Imperial sources. Their influence is described as pervasive yet difficult to quantify, operating through channels that bypass conventional hierarchies. Additional findings focus on the Legion's response to the destruction of Monarchia. Inquisitorial analysis of post-incident behaviour indicates a shift in internal dynamics. While outward compliance with Imperial directives is maintained, subtle changes in tone and approach are observed. Campaign reports following Monarchia show an increased emphasis on internal processes and a reduction in overt displays of ideological construction. This shift is interpreted as a form of adaptation, suggesting that the Legion is capable of modifying its external presentation without altering its internal structure. Several agents report that word-bearer forces exhibit a tendency to operate with a level of autonomy that exceeds standard expectations. While all legions possess a degree of independence due to the nature of their command structure, the 17th demonstrates a particular inclination to interpret directives in a manner that aligns with its own established methods. This does not result in direct disobedience. Instead, it produces outcomes that technically fulfill assigned objectives while incorporating additional elements not explicitly authorized. Such behavior is difficult to challenge within existing command frameworks, as it does not constitute a clear violation. Anomalies are also recorded in the handling of information. Inquisitorial attempts to access complete records of certain word-bearer campaigns encounter inconsistencies, including missing segments, altered timelines, and discrepancies between independent accounts. While data degradation and transmission errors are common in large-scale operations, the frequency and distribution of these anomalies suggest the possibility of intentional modification or selective reporting. This remains unconfirmed, but it is noted as a factor requiring continued investigation. Psychological profiling of the Legion, based on accumulated observations, identifies a collective mindset that prioritizes interpretation over reaction. Word-bearer legionaries are described as individuals who do not merely respond to events, but integrate them into a pre-existing conceptual structure. This allows for rapid assimilation of new information without disruption of internal alignment. However, it also implies that their perception of events may be influenced by factors not immediately visible to external observers. The convergence of these elements leads to a set of preliminary conclusions within inquisitorial records. The word-bearers are not classified as openly divergent from Imperial doctrine during this phase. They remain functional, effective, and outwardly compliant. However, they are identified as a legion operating under a level of internal cohesion and interpretive control that is not fully transparent. This lack of transparency, combined with the presence of recurring anomalies, establishes the basis for continued surveillance. It is believed by some within the Inquisition that the Legion's behaviour represents an early stage of ideological divergence, though this remains unconfirmed. Others argue that the observed patterns are simply the result of an unusually disciplined and structured force. The absence of definitive evidence prevents a conclusive determination. As a result, the word-bearers are neither cleared of suspicion nor formally accused. They occupy a position of monitored uncertainty. What distinguishes these findings from earlier assessments is not the identification of overt wrongdoing, but the recognition of potential. The Legion possesses the structural capacity to sustain and propagate a unified interpretation across its entire force. If that interpretation were to deviate from Imperial doctrine, the consequences would extend beyond isolated incidents. They would manifest as coordinated, large-scale shifts in behaviour. At this stage, such a deviation has not been conclusively observed. The word-bearers continue to operate within acceptable parameters, and their contributions to the Great Crusade remain significant. However, the accumulation of impressions, observations, and conspiracy findings establishes a foundation for heightened scrutiny. The Legion is no longer viewed solely as a specialized asset. It is recognized as a variable whose internal state may influence outcomes in ways not fully accounted for in standard strategic models. This recognition marks the transition from passive observation to active monitoring within inquisitorial oversight. The word-bearers are not yet condemned, but they are no longer taken at face value. Their actions are recorded with greater detail, their communications examined with increased attention, and their influence assessed with a broader scope. The full implications of these measures will only become apparent in later stages, but the shift in perspective is already evident. The Legion has moved from being understood to being questioned. Interrogative records obtained by inquisitorial operatives following word-bearer compliance actions provide deeper insight into the mechanisms underlying observed behavioral patterns. These records are derived from structured questioning of civilian administrators, captured resistance members, auxiliary personnel, and in rare instances individuals who had direct contact with Legion representatives outside formal military engagement. While the reliability of such testimonies varies, cross-comparison reveals recurring consistencies that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Subjects questioned regarding the immediate aftermath of word-bearer occupation frequently describe a phase of intense informational exposure. This phase includes repeated instruction, guided assembly, and the dissemination of unified narratives explaining the nature of the Imperium and the role of its forces. Unlike standard compliance indoctrination, which emphasizes authority and consequence, the word-bearer approach appears to focus on internal acceptance. Individuals report not only understanding their new position, but feeling compelled to agree with it. This compulsion is not described as coercion in the conventional sense. Instead, it manifests as a gradual alignment of perception, often accompanied by a diminishing capacity to articulate prior beliefs. Further interrogation reveals that key figures within local governance structures were often engaged directly by Legion representatives prior to broader population exposure. These interactions are characterized by extended dialogue sessions in which concepts of order, purpose, and inevitability are introduced and reinforced. In several accounts, subjects describe these exchanges as transformative, resulting in a complete re-evaluation of their previous loyalties. The speed at which such changes occur is identified as anomalous, particularly in populations with established cultural or ideological resistance to external authority. Anomalies are also observed in the consistency of language used across disparate regions. Transcripts of recorded speeches, instructional materials, and public declarations show a high degree of uniformity in phrasing and structure. This uniformity persists despite variations in local language and context, suggesting the presence of a centralized source for doctrinal content. While standardization is not unusual in Imperial operations, the precision and repetition observed in these cases exceed typical parameters. The effect of this consistency is to reinforce a singular interpretive framework across multiple populations simultaneously. Inquisitorial examination of recovered texts and data fragments indicates that some materials used by the word-bearers contain layered meaning structures. Surface-level content aligns with accepted Imperial doctrine, emphasizing unity, order, and compliance. However, deeper analysis reveals patterns of phrasing and symbolic arrangement that do not correspond directly to standard teachings. The significance of these patterns remains unclear at this stage, but their presence is consistently noted across multiple sources. Documented encounters between inquisitorial agents and word-bearer units provide additional evidence of deviation in behavior. In several instances, agents operating under covert observation protocols reported that legionaries engaged in activities outside standard operational requirements. These activities included the assembly of small groups for private recitation, the marking of structures with symbols not recognized in official Imperial records, and the performance of coordinated actions that appear to have no immediate tactical purpose. One particular encounter, recorded during a post-compliance audit of a frontier world, describes a word-bearer detachment conducting a series of synchronized movements within a newly constructed structure. The movements were executed with precision and repeated at regular intervals. When questioned indirectly through local intermediaries, the activity was described as a form of alignment or calibration. No further explanation was provided, and direct inquiry was not pursued due to operational constraints. The purpose of these actions remains unidentified. Additional anomalies are recorded in the behavior of auxiliary forces operating under word-bearer command. These forces, drawn from local populations, exhibit rapid adaptation to Legion protocols and display levels of coordination that exceed typical expectations for newly integrated units. Interrogative findings suggest that this adaptation is not solely the result of training. Subjects report experiencing a sense of clarity and direction that persists even in the absence of direct oversight. This phenomenon is not fully understood, but is consistently associated with prolonged exposure to Legion personnel and practices. Encounters with individuals formerly resistant to Imperial authority further highlight the extent of this influence. In multiple cases, captured insurgents who had previously engaged in organized opposition were found to have adopted positions aligned with word-bearer doctrine following brief periods of interaction. These individuals did not exhibit signs of physical coercion or conventional psychological conditioning. Instead, their responses during interrogation indicate a genuine shift in perspective, accompanied by an inability or unwillingness to recall prior motivations in detail. Inquisitorial analysts examining these findings propose several potential explanations. One hypothesis suggests that the word-bearers employ advanced methods of psychological conditioning that are more effective than standard Imperial techniques. Another proposes that the observed effects are the result of cumulative influence, with repeated exposure leading to gradual alignment over time. A third, less widely supported theory considers the possibility of non-conventional factors influencing perception and cognition, though evidence for this remains inconclusive at this stage. Further complexity arises from inconsistencies in recorded timelines. In several documented encounters, the duration between initial contact and full population integration appears shorter than expected based on standard models. These discrepancies are not easily explained by variations in resistance levels or environmental conditions. While data gaps and reporting errors may account for some differences, the pattern is sufficiently consistent to warrant attention. Attempts to directly interrogate word-bearer legionaries are extremely limited due to operational realities. However, indirect observation provides some insight into their internal state. Legionaries are noted to respond to external inquiry with controlled precision, offering information that is technically accurate while omitting contextual detail. Their communication style remains consistent regardless of questioning intensity, suggesting a high level of internal regulation. No evidence of internal conflict or uncertainty is observed during these interactions. The role of key figures such as Kor Phaeron and Erebus continues to be a focal point within inquisitorial analysis. Both individuals are associated with the dissemination of practices and concepts that align with the anomalies described. While direct evidence linking them to specific deviations is limited, their influence is consistently present in regions where irregularities are most pronounced. This correlation is noted as significant, though not yet definitive. Cumulative assessment of interrogative findings, anomalies, and documented encounters leads to an expansion of the Inquisition's initial concerns. The word-bearers are no longer viewed solely as a legion with unusual operational preferences. They are identified as a force capable of producing measurable changes in behaviour and perception within both their own ranks and external populations. The mechanisms by which these changes occur remain partially understood, but their effects are consistently observed. At this stage, the Inquisition refrains from formal accusation. The absence of explicit violation of Imperial doctrine, combined with the Legion's continued effectiveness in achieving compliance, prevents immediate action. However, the threshold for concern has been elevated. The accumulation of anomalies suggests that the word-bearers operate with an additional layer of influence that is not fully accounted for within standard Imperial frameworks. This realization informs subsequent monitoring efforts. Surveillance protocols are expanded, data collection intensified, and analytical resources allocated to further investigation. The Legion's actions are no longer interpreted in isolation. They are examined within a broader context that considers both immediate outcomes and potential long-term implications. The findings of this phase do not provide definitive answers. They do, however, establish a clear trajectory. The word-bearers are moving along a path that diverges incrementally from established norms. Each individual deviation remains within acceptable limits. Taken together, they form a pattern that suggests the presence of an underlying system not fully aligned with Imperial doctrine. The significance of this pattern lies not only in what is currently observed, but in what it may become. A Legion capable of reshaping perception, maintaining internal cohesion, and operating with controlled precision possesses the capacity to influence events beyond conventional parameters. Whether this capacity will remain within acceptable bounds or extend into more significant deviation remains undetermined at this stage. The Inquisition records the evidence, notes the uncertainty, and continues its observation. Classified records compiled during the final stage of inquisitorial review consolidate prior observations into restricted documents marked for limited circulation. These files, sealed under authority due to their interpretive nature and potential strategic implications, do not present definitive accusations. Instead, they organize accumulated evidence into structured assessments designed to inform high-level decision-making. The tone of these records differs from earlier reports. Uncertainty remains, but it is now accompanied by an increased willingness to consider outcomes previously regarded as improbable. Central to these classified assessments is the recognition that the word-bearers operate under a cohesive internal system that extends beyond conventional command structures. This system integrates belief, communication, and operational execution into a unified framework. It is no longer treated as a series of isolated anomalies. It is identified as a deliberate architecture, maintained across the Legion with consistency and precision. The existence of such a framework raises the possibility that the Legion's actions are guided by a set of principles not fully aligned with Imperial doctrine. Further analysis of intercepted communications and recovered data fragments reveals patterns that had previously been noted but not fully contextualized. Phrases, symbols, and structural repetitions observed across multiple campaigns are re-examined in aggregate. When viewed collectively, these elements form sequences that suggest intentional layering of meaning. While surface-level interpretation remains compatible with Imperial messaging, deeper analysis indicates the presence of alternative interpretive pathways. These pathways are not explicitly defined within the records, but their consistency implies design rather than coincidence. Classified encounter reports provide additional clarity regarding the Legion's internal operations. In rare instances where inquisitorial agents observed word-bearer activities without external interference, the Legion is seen conducting coordinated actions that align with previously noted anomalies. These actions are executed with precision and repetition, indicating established protocols rather than spontaneous behavior. The absence of immediate tactical purpose reinforces the assessment that these activities serve functions not directly related to conventional warfare. One such report describes a sequence of synchronized vocalizations and movements conducted by a detachment within an enclosed structure following the conclusion of active combat operations. Environmental readings taken during the event indicate no measurable change in physical conditions. However, personnel present reported a perceptible shift in atmosphere, described as increased pressure or intensity. While subjective in nature, these accounts are recorded due to their consistency across multiple witnesses. The event is classified as an anomaly pending further investigation. The role of key individuals within the Legion is further examined in these classified files. Kor Phaeron and Erebus are identified as central nodes within the Legion's internal network of influence. Their activities are correlated with regions and operations where anomalies are most pronounced. While direct evidence linking them to specific deviations remains limited, the frequency of their association with irregularities elevates their significance within the overall assessment. Both figures are noted as operating with a level of autonomy that complicates direct analysis. Additional concern arises from the Legion's capacity for controlled adaptation. Following the destruction of Monarchia, the Word-Bearers demonstrated an ability to alter their external presentation while maintaining internal continuity. This adaptability is interpreted as evidence of a resilient underlying structure, capable of absorbing external pressure without disruption. In strategic terms, such a capability reduces the effectiveness of corrective measures based solely on observable behaviour. The classified files also address the potential implications of the Legion's internal alignment. A force that operates with such a high degree of cohesion can execute complex operations with minimal internal resistance. If the guiding principles of that cohesion were to diverge significantly from Imperial doctrine, the resulting actions would likely be coordinated and sustained. This scenario is identified as a potential risk, though it is not confirmed to be in progress at the time of reporting. Attempts to reconcile observed anomalies with known Imperial practices are ultimately inconclusive. While certain behaviours can be explained through advanced psychological conditioning or disciplined adherence to doctrine, the totality of evidence suggests the presence of additional factors. These factors are not fully understood, and their nature remains undefined within the records. As a result, the Inquisition adopts a position of cautious interpretation, acknowledging the limits of available data while recognizing the potential significance of what has been observed. Conclusion: entries within these classified documents reflect a shift from passive observation to strategic awareness. The Word-Bearers are no longer considered simply a specialized legion with unique operational methods. They are recognized as a force possessing an internal system that is both highly effective and insufficiently transparent. This combination presents both value and risk within the broader context of the Imperium's objectives. The Legion's contributions to the Great Crusade remain substantial. Their ability to achieve stable compliance and maintain control over integrated regions continues to support Imperial expansion. However, the same characteristics that enable these outcomes also create conditions under which deviation could occur without immediate detection. The Inquisition therefore concludes that continued monitoring is essential, with particular attention directed toward the Legion's internal communications, key personnel, and post-compliance activities. It is explicitly stated within several files that no formal action is recommended at this stage. The absence of definitive evidence precludes intervention, and the potential disruption caused by unwarranted action is considered unacceptable. Instead, the recommended approach emphasizes observation, data collection, and readiness to respond should further developments warrant escalation. Retrospective annotations appended to these files, added in later periods, suggest that the significance of the recorded anomalies was not fully appreciated at the time of initial analysis. Patterns that were once considered minor deviations are reinterpreted as early indicators of a broader transformation. These annotations do not alter the original conclusions but provide context for subsequent events. In final assessment, the classified records of the Inquisition present the Word-Bearers as a legion operating at the intersection of efficiency and uncertainty. Their structure, methods, and internal alignment produce outcomes that are both beneficial and difficult to fully account for within existing frameworks. They are neither condemned nor exonerated. They are observed, documented, and held within a state of unresolved evaluation. This conclusion completes the progression from initial observation to informed suspicion. The word-bearers have been examined through multiple lenses, each revealing aspects of their nature while leaving critical elements obscured. Their origins, development, and operational behaviour form a coherent narrative of transformation, shaped by belief, structure, and purpose. The final question, left unanswered within these records, concerns the direction of that transformation. At the point where these files are sealed, the Legion remains an active participant in the Great Crusade. Its actions continue to align with Imperial objectives in measurable terms, yet beneath that alignment, a different pattern has begun to emerge, one that is recorded but not yet fully understood. The Inquisition closes its current assessment with awareness rather than resolution, acknowledging that the full implications of what has been observed lie beyond the scope of present analysis.